Hey folks, and welcome to another episode of Hit Reviews with your host, Arlyeon. On today's episode, I'll be talking about the review copy I received of a particular title published by 16-Bit Knights, namely Tauranos. Find out if I thought this labyrinthine survival/adventure game was a good example of devs taking inspiration by the horns, or if it was a whole lot of bullshit. So, there's a bit going on when it comes to the game's plot, but I'll start with the basics. Those being that you're some chump who's decided that wandering into a maze which hosts a murderous Minotaur was apparently a good idea. Only, it's not quite that simple. As you plunge deeper and deeper into the maze, you begin to become aware that things are acutely wrong. Honestly, there's enough foreshadowing that when the plot twist did hit, I wasn't entirely taken aback, but it still made for a solid the heck moment. Also, there's multiple endings to be had, depending on a combination of your actions at the penultimate moment, and, according to the dev, just if you like getting punched to death. That said, I'll say the ending I got, the good one, managed to definitely raise some questions of its own, which more or less fit thematically with a lot of the questions the game had me asking earlier. I literally was squinting at the screen when I noticed a certain detail before going like, ooh. But there's a lot of talking about the journey without really talking much about how I got there. So, let's get down to the basics. Tauranos is a top-down adventure game that leans fairly heavily on exploration as you roam through the decrepit hallways of a trap-laden maze, who, as mentioned earlier, also happens to rent space out to a homicide-happy Minotaur. Whilst progression is simple enough, as most stages can be completed by just avoiding the various traps and finding the exit before the Minotaur catches up to you, and repeatedly pummels you to death, the specifics are where it starts to get complicated. See, while at times it's important for you to go and find the path to the next floor, other times the exit isn't all that tricky to reach. The problem is that you have a variety of skills that you'll want to be increasing, such as your movement speed, max health, stamina, etc. And this can only really be done by seeking out and finding shrines that are hidden throughout the maze. There's also some more hush-hush upgrades, like regenerating health or extra lives. The latter of which actually ends up being super important for a pair of reasons. Reason number one is they have a limited number of lives, 10 to start with, and should you exhaust all of them, it's game over. Reason number two is the fact that you may end up using a lot of those lives, as the game starts out remarkably lethal, with traps more than capable of emptying your health. And, frankly, the Minotaur isn't anything to sniff at either, and not just because caked on entrails and Minotaur musk. See, whilst he starts out in most levels as relatively slow, he becomes gradually faster as you linger in the maze, making your efforts to seek out the sweet fruits of precious secrets. Well, a little trickier than it would otherwise be. The speed upgrades, if you find them, certainly do help in giving you the tactical edge and keeping your distance, but he's more than capable of outpacing you even when you've upgraded your speed when he reaches the upper end of his speed. I mean, there is a means of dropping a speed once per stage, but it's not always a prudent action to take, in part because sometimes the item you need to interact with is going to be wedged at the back of a dead end, and then he's going to punch you to death. Thus, you're left to contend with a nigh indestructible engine of destruction stalking you as you try and run off with anything that isn't nailed down. And did I mention there's a further complication, since using objects is something that forces you to be immobile and complete an action using that precious time and leaving you vulnerable? Because that's a thing, which makes the fact that the Minotaur is slowly gaining speed as you take your time doing things all the more harrowing. Still, if the main story isn't enough for you, there's also the ability to make your own levels. I don't have much to say here, since I think I used most of my creative energies dicking around in RPG Maker a decade or a decade and a half ago. Okay, so moving on, the music in Tauranos is actually really neat to listen to, and actually does a fair bit to add to the ambience and the overall I'm going to die horribly feel. But honestly, what caught me by surprise was the voice acting, which actually turned out to be pretty damn solid and made the characters' soliloquies a lot more fun to experience. I will also confess that I was a fan of the game's graphics as well, as by and large they get the job done. Though I will acknowledge that I have a pair of nitpicks. As much as I found myself appreciating that a number of the objects I need to reach are highlighted by Firefly-esque lights, there's a rather distinct problem that there's also a number of props in some levels that also exude those same lights, which at times led me to wasting a lot of time trying to reach something that wasn't even reachable. And whilst yes, there are secret passages, the game is actually pretty nice about letting you know what items you acquired or missed, they only do so at the end of a stage. So it just got compounded because there was just times where I didn't get to find out that the fireflies were fucking with me until the end of a stage. You know, or just after they successfully lured me to my death. Beyond that, my other nitpick was that in a few areas with trap floors, the fog element that occasionally occurred made it incredibly difficult to actually pick out the visual cues that would let me see the objects which normally hint at traps. And that's that. Otherwise, I really like the game's graphic design, and I had to get pretty darn specific to find nitpicks. Which means we're on to the finale, and honestly, by and large, I really do appreciate Tauranos. I had a lot of fun streaming it, with the process of exploring the mage and gradually learning the various mechanics of the game. And I'll admit that despite the initial dread that the words permadeath left me, the live system felt forgiving, especially when I went on my way to explore. Still, there were the occasional pangs of frustration, and not only because of the things I mentioned in graphics, but also in the nature of the game itself. And that's because whilst it's an exploration game, it's also a relatively linear stage-based game, which provides you no means of backtracking through stages, other than restarting from scratch. And as I said earlier, the game does allow you to know when you've missed an object, but only when you've completed the stage, which can feel sort of like it's taunting you sometimes when you're near the end and don't know if there's something missing until after. Still, that's a pretty specific thing there, especially with everything else Tauranos brings to the table, including some non-linearity in the paths that you can take late game. So I can safely say it does warrant being called a hit. I definitely recommend giving this game a spin if you're a fan of adventure games, exploration, and things which avoid direct combat. And even for those daunted by the idea of permadeath, it really isn't as bastardly as I initially expected. Most of the time. Anyways, that's a wrap, so I'd like to thank you folks for both tuning in and sticking till the end. Whether you agree or disagree with my thoughts, I'd love to hear from you folks in the comments. And for those interested in more indie reviews or interviews with the developers, feel free to hit the subscribe button and the bell icon so you can get notified when we have a new release. You can also join our Discord, click the link in the banner or the description so you can become a part of our community. It's cozy there. Lastly, if you'd like to help support the channel, we do have a Ko-fi running now to help supplement funds for our lovely editors and to make sure we can continue to provide quality content. Again, check the description and the banner for them links. Anywho, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.